So one question I've been asked over and over again is which settings I use on the Sony ZV-1. So today we're going to go through this camera and I'm going to show you how I set up everything on my camera and how you can set up everything for photo, for video, and for slow motion, and how to save every one of those into the memory recall so that you can quickly get to each one of those with a couple quick button hits. All right, so go get your camera out, get a fresh battery, and let's follow along and set up your camera. So the first thing we're going to set up today is for photography. You are going to be going through these menus back and forth kind of several times as we set each one of these up to save to the memory recall. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to jump into our mode and kind of quick go through these. Just a quick little rundown. So one thing you're going to want to do is get familiar with the modes on this camera. Just real quick, we're going to show. So we have movie mode, high frame rate, which is like your burst mode, slow-mo, memory recall. We're going to be coming back to this quite a bit. Scene selection, panorama, and then these are all your manual settings for photography. So you have manual, shutter priority, aperture priority, and program auto. You have intelligent photo and intelligent video. So we're gonna start by setting up this camera in photography, just because that's the first menu in the camera. So I'm gonna jump mine down to manual exposure, just because I'm gonna run all manual settings for photography on this camera. So select that, and then what you're gonna wanna do is go into menu. And so the first thing we see here is the file format. This is going to be what you want to select your photos to look like. So if you want them to be JPEGs, or if you want them to be RAW photos, or a mix of both. So I would select RAW if you plan on like editing your photos in things like Lightroom, where you need the most amount of data. Otherwise, I would run just JPEG, because if you run RAW and you're not planning on editing these, you're going to have to convert them back to JPEGs anyways. So start with JPEG, and JPEG quality, we're going to just leave at fine. You can go to extra fine if you want. Image size, I'm going to go with that. Aspect ratio, so 3:2 is going to be the default. That's going to be your standard photo. If you're doing thumbnails, you would want to jump into like 16:9. I'm going to leave mine at 3:2 for now, and then I just remember to toggle to 16:9 if I'm doing thumbnails. So that's tab 1, page 1. Let's go to page 2. Those ones you're going to want to leave how they are. Page 3, so shoot mode would be your manual, shutter aperture would be what you're shooting in. We're gonna leave it at manual for that one. Drive mode, single shooting is what I have mine set at. I think that's what the camera defaults. So this would be, you push the shutter, it takes a photo. Continuous shooting would be you hold down the shutter and it's gonna do burst mode photos. And this would be good for like high action things where you want to get the right shot, and then you can go back later and kind of select which picture you want to take out of there. You have single timers, but we're gonna leave ours at single shooting for now. Interval shooting, this is going to be for like time lapses. I have mine set to off for now because we're going to put this in the function menu later and control that later. Shooting time start, set mine for 2 seconds. And then every 2 seconds is my interval where it'll take another photo. And the number of shots that you're going to put on here kind of depends on how long of a footage you want in video. If you're doing like 24 frames per second video timeline, that means you need to get 10 seconds of video, you need 240 shots. That's just a quick way to remember it. So every 10 seconds would be 240 photos. So we're going to go on to back to the menu here. We're going to leave that off for now. So then page 4 is going to be our memory recall. We're going to come back to this in a little bit here. Page 5, this camera starts, I believe it's single shot autofocus. We want to change that to continuous autofocus. And this would be also where if you wanted to run manual focus or something, you can change it to that as well. This camera doesn't really have the greatest of manual focus adjustability, so I like just leaving continuous autofocus. Focus area, I like to leave mine set at wide. You can definitely go for photography like center, because most of the time the objects you're shooting will be in the center of your frame. I just like to leave mine in wide and go from there. Mostly because wide is also what I use in video, and I just like to keep that setting the same. So face tracking and eye tracking is this one. You definitely want to keep this one turned on, unless for some reason like you're shooting photography of like buildings with people around and you don't want the face track to like lock in on a person. That would be the only time I would ever really turn this off. Otherwise leave it on. So then the subject detection, this is going to be set between either human or like dog or cat. So if you are shooting like dogs and cats, definitely flip the thing down to the little kitty cat. Otherwise, keep it at human. Right eye, left eye select. This would be if you actually want to control which eye is being tracked. I just leave it at auto. The frame display, you want to leave that on. That just kind of puts the frame around your face so you can tell it's working. Page, let's go back here. So next, these ones you can change the focus frame color if you really want. You can change it to white or red. I like to leave mine at white. So then moving on to the next page, page 6. That one we're gonna leave all those settings the same. Exposure, this would be where you control now. So setting up your ISO on this for photography, I just like to set mine for like 125 or 100, depending on whatever the lowest is. And then once I actually get into the shot, when I'm shooting photography, I'll actually spin the ISO up until it's at where I want. You can definitely leave this in automatic or auto if you want. And if you do that, just definitely change your range for your low and your high, so it doesn't go past those points. This would be like your min and your max for auto. I'm just gonna leave mine at 125 because I like shooting everything in manual. ND filter, this would be kind of, this camera does have an internal ND filter. This is probably something that you'll use more in video, but you can definitely use it for photography. I'm not sure if it's strong enough yet on this camera to be able to do kind of motion blur with like waterfalls and rivers and things like that. Turn it on or off. I'm going to leave it off because I'm going to control that in my function menu. Metering mode, multi, face priority, turn that on. We'll skip page 8 and we'll go to page 9. So white balance I would leave at auto. If you are in a scene and it looks weird, that's when I would switch it to either like daylight, shade, cloudy, or if you have like white balance cards, you can definitely go down here and set custom white balances. I do have a video on that if you want to check out how to change those. I'll put a link in the description. Otherwise, for now, we're going to leave it at auto. So priority set, we'll leave that standard. So the D range optimizer, this is going to be your dynamic range. I just leave mine at auto. It's going to turn off if you use any picture profiles. So if you leave that in auto, it'll turn off by itself. This one, creative style, this would be your standard, your vivid, portrait, landscape, sunset. I've really only ever used standard or portrait just because portrait's kind of a flatter image and you can kind of push these a little bit in editing software. Otherwise, standard is a really good color for this camera. This camera does have the new color science, so I just leave mine standard. Picture effect, I don't ever touch these. This was just kind of goofy, different filters that you'll probably never use. So we'll keep that off. Picture profile, this is going to be used probably more in video, but this is going to be your S-Log, your HLG, your Cine 4, so you can change for a different dynamic range. So for photography, I'm going to leave this turned off. We do have this set in our function menu that we'll come back to as well. Page 10, soft skin effect, I'm going to leave that turned off. This page 11, we're going to leave alone. So page 12, product showcase, we're going to leave that turned off because that's going to be in our function menu. Face registration, this would be if you want your camera to kind of learn your face. I don't know how well that actually works, but it kind of gives you more of a priority of focus if you're like in a group of people. Smile shutter, kind of the same thing. This would be if like you're shooting some portraits and someone smiles, the camera I think will actually go and take a photo when they smile. I leave that turned off because I like to control my own camera. All right, so now we're going to go back to page 4 and go to our memory recall. So we're going to click that, and I'm going to actually put our photos on page 3 on the top here. So when you go up here and then hit select, this is going to now completely save everything that we just did to memory recall number 3. So now when we go back to our modes, if you go to memory recall, which is MR, you can go up to the top here, and now you can go jump into all of your settings for photography and everything will be there. Okay, so now you got your photos all set up. So let's go back now and let's start over and let's set this thing up for video. Okay, so now let's go back to our mode setting on top and go to the movie settings. If you want to shoot in program auto, there's not a lot you really need to set up personally, because the camera is going to make a lot of those decisions for you anyways. If you want to set yours to aperture priority, this is going to be, you set the aperture on the camera, which is the amount of light that comes in through the front of the lens, and it's going to stay locked on that aperture, and then it'll fluctuate the shutter and the ISO to control the exposure. Shutter is another one for video that If I were to use any kind of automated ones, I would probably do shutter priority, because that way you kind of keep the shutter exactly how you want it for video, and let the aperture and the ISO control the exposure instead. The higher the shutter goes, the less motion blur you're going to start getting, and it's going to start looking kind of jittery and weird once it gets too high. So I shoot in 24 frames per second, so on this camera that means I would shoot in 1/50th on my shutter. So what we're going to do for this setup anyways is going to do manual exposure. So this will be manually setting all of the settings into the camera. So let's start with that one. We're going to be starting again back on tab 1 because you're going to still use a couple of these settings for video. We can skip page 1, page 2. In fact, we can actually jump all the way to page 5. So on page 5, we are going to change, or actually we're going to leave the focus mode still on continuous autofocus. This would be if you set photo to center, this would be where I would go back and set it to wide for video. Setting it to wide, I think, is going to give you the kind of the best option for video. So autofocus, we're going to leave that on. Everything should still stay the way it was in the last one, so we'll leave that alone. Let's go back. Let's go to page 7. So 7, this would be where if you are doing a video and you're doing a lot of running gunning, you can set it to auto, and then it's going to control the ISO all the time. If you're doing a lot of vlogging and moving around between lighting sources, I would probably just go ahead and switch this to auto, because you're going to have a lot less headaches with it and trying to set this manually otherwise. Otherwise, once again, you can switch it to manual ISO, but then you are literally going to have to control your ISO every time you move out of any different light source. It's not too complicated to do, but it is something that a lot of people get a headache. So for this purposes, I'm going to switch this to auto if you're doing vlogging. ND filter, we're going to keep that turned off because I'm going to put that in our function menu. Let's see, moving forward to page 9, white balance. So auto white balance, I'm not a really big fan of. I did notice in the past when I was color grading things, you would get something to look good, and then like seconds later it would look bad. You didn't realize that the auto white balance is actually shifting all the time. So in this case, I personally like to set mine every time to like a custom one based on the environment that you're in. So if you're like outdoors in the daylight, I would switch it to daylight, shade, clouds, whatever the case may be. Or if you have like a white balance card, once again, switch it to that. If you are just constantly running around moving and you're not super concerned about color grading, go ahead and keep this on auto. We're gonna leave that standard. We're gonna leave that on. We're gonna switch that. So picture profile for video. If you're planning on doing a ton of color grading and you have the right conversion LUTs, this would be where you would switch your things to like your movie, your S-Log, your Cine 4, your HLG. If you are confident in color grading and doing a lot of post-production stuff, I would use some of these. I can do another video later about the picture profiles on this camera, but these picture profiles do match a lot of the other Sony cameras, which is nice, so that this works really well as like a B and C cam for other Sony cameras. For the purposes of this video, we're going to leave it at standard. Standard is a really good look on this camera, by the way. Okay, so moving on. Soft skin, we're going to leave that off. We're going to leave all that alone. Okay, so now we're going to go into page 2. Now this is more of the actual video modes. So we're going to keep ours at manual exposure because we are going to be doing this all manually. So file format, this is now where you would select what you're trying to shoot for video. I shoot in 4K on this channel, so I leave mine all the time at 4K. You can definitely change it to HD as well, but these are the two settings you'll be using on this camera. If you're using 4K, you have some options here. If you go down to the next one, you have record settings. Now this is the frame rates and the megabits that it runs for video. So if you want to shoot in 30 frames a second, these are your two options. 100 megabits has a higher data, so it's going to look better than the 60. I personally run 24 frames a second, so I choose the 24-100. If you do have a slow computer, you might have a problem with 4K and the 100 megabits per second. You can always change this to 60 and see if that helps your computer out a little bit. If not, you might be stuck in running HD settings instead. Real quick, we'll show you the settings on there too. So HD settings you have in record settings, a whole new list pops up here. So you have 60 frames a second in a couple different settings. You have 30 frames a second, 24 frames a second, and 120 frames a second. So your 120 and your 60 frames a second are going to be kind of what you would use if you're going to plan on doing kind of slow-mo shots or a lot of like kind of B-roll. I personally always go for 120 because you can slow it down this would be the slowest you can go. Like the higher the frame rate, the more you can slow down the footage. And you can still do the same speed as 60 in 100 and it'll still look fairly similar. So I usually pick 120 when I do this setting, but we'll come back to that in a sec here. So go back to 4K, set mine at 24 frames. Your high frame rate settings, this would be kind of your burst mode, slow-mo. This camera does have 3 different options for slow motion. We're going to leave ours at 24 frames a second because that's what I shoot in. Now your frame rate, you have 240, 480, and 960. 240 is an HD, 480 and 960 are not really HD. They're kind of maybe 720 and then even less. 960 is going to be very slow. And honestly, it really doesn't look super great on this camera, but if you need to use it, it's something that you can do. And then these, actually what they do is once you select when you want it to start, it kind of takes a photo for about 1 to 2 seconds and then it renders down in slow motion. So it's kind of a burst mode. It's not something you just hit record. It's a little different. We can get into that later. I leave mine at 240 because that's probably all I'm ever going to use. Which is 10 times slow motion. Okay, so going back here, we'll go to the next page, page 2, image size. We're going to skip that. Proxy. If your computer really has a tough time recording 4K, you can't select this and turn it on. What it's going to do is it's going to double the file, and one's going to be 4K and one's going to be not HD. That way you can edit with your non-HD, and then you can replace that edit with the 4K version. Your computer and your editing software usually has the same function, so I would usually use your computer over the camera, so you can probably leave that off. Okay, so going to the drive speed here, I like to switch mine to fast, because if you are doing like vlogging, you want this thing to focus on you quick. If it looks weird and it's too fast, definitely just switch it down to normal. And if you're trying to be more cinematic, normal and slow is probably going to be your better bet. I like to always keep this on responsive. Moving on to the next page. Audio recording, definitely leave that on. Recording level. This is going to be how loud your mic is. This camera, when you default it without a microphone, it's probably going to be sitting anywhere from 23 to 26. The goal is to try to kind of just stay in at this -12. Don't really go over it too much. That's where I like to keep my audio levels. So every voice is different, every environment is different, so I always just kind of monitor that and make sure it's where you kind of want it. Because normally I run different microphones on here, I'm running mine anywhere from 2 to about 7, depending on the mic, and then I let the microphone do the heavy lifting. Audio level display, turn that on. And so wind noise reduction. So you would think this is a good thing. You would want to turn it on to reduce that wind noise. I will go ahead and say this right now. Don't ever turn this on. This will give you the worst sound out of a camera you'll have ever heard. It sounds like you're behind glass or underwater. So just always leave that off. Don't ever turn it on. So your steady shot, I leave mine in standard and then move to active if I need to. Standard is a pretty good stabilization. Active is definitely quite a bit better. Active does crop in though a little bit. And one thing that I've noticed in active mode for steady shot is that while you're walking around with the camera, when you take steps, sometimes you'll get like a split little second of a kind of a blur on your footage from the active mode, trying to compensate the motion. It's not a big deal, but active mode is something I tend to use more when I'm doing like handheld shots and a little bit less vlogging. If you're really good at walking around and being slow and steady, active mode works great for vlogging, but it does crop in a little bit closer to you. So Moving on, page 4, marker display, you can turn that off, you can leave that off. Record lamp, that I think defaults to on. This little light on the front here will turn on when you are vlogging, so you can kind of see if you're recording. It's definitely a nice feature, because I've definitely filmed plenty of things in the past where you get done filming and you realize you had it off. You weren't recording. So if you ever are in a scenario though where you want to be discreet and you don't want people to know you're filming them, turn it off. Movie with shutter, you can control the record set. You can turn recording on with your normal shutter. Because this has the record button right behind it, it's no use for that. USB streaming. So this is one, if you did the firmware update recently to the version 2, this will be now on your camera. USB streaming, what that allows you to do is just basically plug in your USB cable straight to your computer, and without any other programs, it'll come up on your computer now as a webcam. It gives you a couple different options, I think 480 and 720, 720 being the max resolution. But that is the probably easiest way now to do like webcam streaming, so you can use that if you want. Otherwise, I do have another video to show you how to do streaming on your camera in higher quality. Okay, so these, I'll just leave those alone. Optical zoom, this will be just for the zoom. You can change it to clear image zoom and get a little bit further. You can have a digital crop that'll go a little further than what the lens can do. I just leave that off. I do turn my zoom speed to fast because normal is way too slow. Okay, so your display button is going to be this button right here on the wheel on the top. That's how you can control your stuff. This is what you want or don't want. I'm just going to leave those the way they are because I pretty much look at all of those anyways. Zebra settings, if you are using any of the picture profiles, you're going to want this. I would keep it turned off and turn this into your function menu, but I would change your zebra level to like 95 or 100 depending on what log footage you're using. Grid line, I turned mine on to diagonal plus square grid. That's going to give you a grid plus like an X through the middle so you can kind of see what's dead center. Moving on, so custom keys. This is where we would set up our C2 and our C1 custom key that's on this camera and all of our dials. So this top one is for photography and this bottom one is for video. Since we're doing video right now, let's set this one up. Defaults to product showcase with the trash can button here. That is going to be where it removes the face tracking, and then anything you put in front of the camera is going to just immediately focus to it. So if you're kind of showing off like products or gear, this is something I would turn on to that so that it'll just focus very fast. Otherwise, you kind of have to block your face off with the thing you're showing for it to focus to that. Number 2 is your middle, focus standard. I leave it at that. For video, I actually like turning my left joystick to autofocus, manual focus toggle. So this will allow me to change it to manual focus if I need to. So you can change that if you want. Otherwise, you can leave it which is default, I believe, the drive shoot or drive mode. And then number 4 is your right side. I always leave that in ISO because that's how every Sony camera is. And then same thing with photography. Before we get too far, let's see. There is a page 2. That is going to be the top button on top. Leave that as background defocus if you want. When you hit that, basically it blurs the background and it changes your camera to the lowest aperture it can go in. You can change that to other things, but I just like to leave mine on background defocus. And also, if you're not using any of these other ones, if you're not using this one for product showcase, you can definitely put your ND filter right here, so you can just turn it on and off really quick. But I like to use the product showcase there. Photography, it's going to be the same deal. You can set up yours how you want. I have mine set for subject detection, which is human or animal, focus standard, drive mode, and ISO. Okay, so now we have these all set. I'm going to go back to tab 1 and page 4, and we're going to put this in memory recall number 1. This is our regular 4K video. So select that, and now it's saved into that first slot. All right, so one thing that I like to do with this camera is set this thing up for 120 frames per second because the slow motion on this camera looks really good. So we're not going to change a lot of the settings from when we set this up for video, just a few different things. So let's get back into that. Real quick, we'll set up the 120 frames per second mode. You're going to basically just leave everything the same. You are just going to jump to tab 2, page 1, change your file format to HD, go down to record setting and switch to 120 frames per second. On these settings, you want to change your shutter speed for the frame rate. So we're in 120 frames per second, so we want to actually switch this to 1/250. That'll give us the correct shutter speed for 120 frames per second. So now we'll go back to our menu and set this into our number 2. And real quick, I'm going to check to make sure that our first one is in 1/50th. Yep, so our first one was saved in 1/50 because I'm shooting in 24 frames a second, so you would go to 1/50 because you doubled your frame rate. Okay, so real quick, we're going to jump back into the menu one more time here. I'm going to skip to tab 2 and we're going to go to page 8. So 8 is going to be our function menu set. Now this is going to be, this little FN button on here is going to be a quick button to jump into all of these settings. The top one is your photography and the bottom one is your video. And if you see the little like photography logo down here on the bottom, that just means it's copied over from the top. So on photography, I like to actually change my drive mode to interval shooting. This will give me quick access to get to time lapses. We're going to leave that as focus mode. We're going to leave this as focus area. That'll let you change focus areas, exposure compensation, ISO, product showcase set, shoot mode, we'll leave that. ND filter, this is something you'll use a little bit. So white balance, this would be your white balance. This is your soft skin effect and your steady shots. So we're going to leave those ones alone. On video, 100% put your audio record level on here. That one's definitely one you want. Your focus function menu, we want to leave that. Centering, exposure, ISO. Mode. This one, creative style, I would probably change this one to picture profile for video. White balance, leave that there. Soft skin, this is something, if you guys never use this, just take it out of your menu. You don't need it. Steady shot, we're going to leave that one to that so we can change from active. So that one is going to be how I have mine set. So feel free to copy my settings if you want. So next one, back in tab 2, page 8, function of touch operation. I leave mine to touch tracking. You can change it to touch focus, but touch tracking for me, I use that more often. What this does is it allows you to tap on a subject and now the focus will follow said subject. You can still turn it off there. You can kind of do the focus racking by using this as well. So you can kind of still use this the same way as the other one is, which is the touch focus. This would be this kind of similar deal where you're going to touch focus and it's going to spot focus. But I like leaving mine on touch tracking. This is also something too, if you want to add this into your function menu, so you turn that off in case you bump your screen a lot, you can always do that too. Movie button, leave that as always. And so network, this is something we're going to probably skip over. This would be like if you want to send your photos to your smartphone, view on TV, PC remote function. This would be if you're going to be connecting to a computer to do like USB or stuff. We're going to skip this tab. This would be where you would go to link the Bluetooth handle for the Sony camera. Let's see here. Playback, we're going to pretty much leave all those. Gamma assist would be, you can turn this on if you're using picture profiles. It'll make the camera look a little less flat and it'll kind of give you a normal look. Volume settings, turn this all the way to 15 because the volume on this camera is not good out of the speaker. Keep the delete confirmation always as cancel first so you don't accidentally cancel things you don't want to. Power save time, I turn mine to 2 minutes instead of 5. You don't need to kill your batteries for no reason. Let's see here. So this one's important here. The auto power off temp. Change this from standard to high. This will make it so that your camera doesn't shut off when you're shooting 4K videos after a few minutes. Touch operation, leave that on. HDMI settings, if you're using external monitors, this would be where you would go to control any of the settings for that. We're going to skip that. USB connection, I leave mine at mass storage. I leave this as multi. Power supply, I leave mine turned on, so that way when you plug in the USB to the side, it can power the camera. Using like a power bank, or if you're plugged into your computer, that will actually power it as well. And then format would be the only thing else on this setting that I would look at. This would be if you want to delete everything off your SD card, put it back in your camera and hit format, and it'll delete the whole SD card and reformat it fresh. And then page 6 is going to be if you want to reset all of your camera back to default settings, go ahead and select that. And then the only last thing that's really on this camera is the My Menu setting. This is like another way to put items that you always have to try to find into a quick menu. So if you're constantly going back and trying to hunt down for things that you can't find, put them in here, and then when you're done, go to Display from Menu, turn that on. That way, anytime you hit menu, it'll always come to the screen first. All right, so now we just have to go back to our memory recall when we are doing anything now, and you have your 4K, your 120 frames a second, and all of your sets for photography. Right, so now we got this whole camera set up, so pretty much you're ready to go outside and start shooting photos, video, do some slow motion. If you do have any other questions, something I missed, go ahead and leave me a comment down below, and I'll try to answer it. If you found the video useful, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to follow along to other gear reviews, film tutorials, and other vlogs. And hit that bell for notifications, then you'll be notified every time I put out a video. And as always, you guys, catch you on the next one. Later.